Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Comment Visions in association with Shell to discuss the very topical subject of unconventional gas. Will unconventional gas become conventional? For those of you who haven't been to a Comment Visions event before, if I could just quickly give you a bit of history. Comment Visions is a partnership between European Voice and Euronews in association with Shell, which started back in 2005. The aim is to provide a forum for comment and debate on major current energy and environment issues. It has a number of features. There'll be a short report on Euronews. There's a website called commentvisions.com on which you're warmly invited to make your comments. And what you see before you this evening, a debate event in Brussels. The aim of today's debate is to examine the development of unconventional gas over the last few years, and to look at its potential to transform Europe's energy situation, the possibility of adding new indigenous supplies and reducing dependence on imports. We'd like to focus on the issue from three perspectives, but of course you're welcome to add some of your own. Availability. Is the gas there and can it be extracted safely? Affordability. Is unconventional gas competitive? And very importantly, acceptability. Will European citizens accept the extraction of unconventional gas as readily as people have done in the US? And also, are we prolonging our reliance on hydrocarbons instead of gearing up for a faster shift to the low-carbon future that we hear so much about? The energy market, as I don't need to tell you, is full of ups and downs, rather like the World Cup, which saw Italy leave this afternoon after losing to Slovakia. Don't know if you've had a chance to check that. In recent years, we had high prices, and we had gas supply disruptions because of the Russia-Ukraine dispute in January 2009. And of course, those disruptions have come back recently, in recent days, in this case affecting Belarus. The European Union has responded with a range of policy initiatives which have really driven energy policy to one of the key EU policy areas, as Philip will no doubt agree with his recent choice of dossier change. The famous 2020 targets, the internal energy market liberalisation, the strategic energy review, the focus on energy efficiency. I could go on, but I would risk boring you. What we're here to talk about is the rapid development of shale gas in the US and how it's transformed the supply situation there, particularly with the effect of diverting LNG supplies into the EU with an effect on prices. We need to look at what's the potential for a similar shift in the European Union. Just before I hand over to the first of our speakers, I'd just like to draw your attention to a letter of welcome from Mr. Jerzy Buzek, the President of the European Parliament, who was hoping to be with us this evening to give a welcoming address, but unfortunately wasn't able to. But he has written a letter of welcome, which you will find in your packs. And I think there's a very strong message there that we all need to take on board, that we need to start long-term planning for a future, to guard against a future energy crisis, because Mr. Buzek makes the point that we were able to react very rapidly to the financial crisis, but to respond to an energy crisis, you need natural resources and technology and infrastructure, and those things can't be set up in a weekend. So I would recommend that letter to you. The running order, we're going to start with an overview, a sort of explanation of the technicalities of unconventional gas from Professor Alan Riley from City University. We thought this would be useful for those of you who are not completely familiar with this rather frontier technology. And then we will go to the individual speakers. Philip Lowe, Director General for Energy at the European Commission, Mrs. Kolarska-Bobinska, a Polish MEP who's the rapporteur on the Strategic Energy Plan, and Stefan Singer from WWF. And I'm very glad that I don't have to do the technical explanation of unconventional gas, but for that we have the very able Mr. Alan Riley. Alan, over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, can I have my first slide, please? Okay, conventional gas is, you probably heard of conventional gas. Relatively very simple. It's normally found together in very large quantities in a kind of vacuum with a salt seal on top. You put a drill down and you pump the gas out. That's about it. There's a bit more technology, but we can ignore that. Unconventional gas is different in the sense that the gas is captured in pockets in rock. They can be rock shale, they can be in coal bed, they can be in sandstones, and it's much more difficult to get out. Now, there was some development in the 19th century, but basically most people gave up when they realized getting it out of conventional wells was a lot easier. Now, what we've always known is that there is a lot more unconventional on the planet than conventional, but basically it was thought to be impossible to access at any reasonable price. So that's why we didn't worry about this rock shale. I can have the next slide. However, a guy called Mr. Mitchell from Mitchell Energy, one of the original Texas wildcatters, worked at this for many years and developed or took existing technology and developed it to apply in the Barnett Shale in Texas, in one of the rock shale plays, to actually start trying to work out ways of getting it out at a reasonable price. And Mr. Mitchell succeeded. He did a lot of work, created a series of technological developments, know-how as much as actual technological breakthroughs to make it work. And he sold out to Devon Energy in 2002 for about $3.5 billion. Now, if you show the next slide, the two key technologies are hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling. Horizontal drilling is relatively straightforward. You go down and you cut out across the rock to help open up the gas fractures. And the other major thing you do is then you use the hydrofracturing high-pressure waters, normally with some liquids in there, to help push the gas out. So hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling. Now, what you use with them as well is what's really helped is better survey technology, which has been able to identify what's the best geology to what's the best shape of the rocks to go after. So that's helped as well. But hydrofracturing and horizontal drilling are core to all of this. Now, what's the impact on the US market been? Well, the next slide, please. That step-by-step transformation has had an enormous impact. In the last 5 years, you've seen the ramping up of unconventional gas production as the technology has got to a point where it can be commercially applied and you can seriously make money out of unconventional gas. That's partly to do with rising gas prices. It's partly to do with increasingly effective technology at lower prices. So you've seen a situation by 2008, half of US gas production was unconventional. And in 2009, the United States became the largest gas producer on the planet, beating Russia, so replacing Russia as the #1 gas producer. And so you see, I think the weight of this and the impact of this can be seen principally in Exxon, who don't on the whole throw money around, spending $40 billion in December 2009 in buying XTO, one of the big unconventional gas producers. So next slide. So what's the issue for the planet? Well, the issue for the planet and the impact on the planet can be seen in some of the figures. This is from the International Energy Agency's figures from the World Energy Outlook for 2009. We're talking about 233 trillion cubic meters of unconventional in the US, 144 trillion cubic meters in China and parts of Central Asia, around 40-ish, 35 trillion cubic meters in Europe perhaps. These are huge figures. And if you compare that with the total existing Russian gas reserve of conventional gas of 47 trillion cubic meters, you begin to see the enormous scale of this. Now, there are two caveats on all of this. All of these figures were done for surveys in which were actually directed at getting conventional gas, not unconventional. So that's one issue. The second is that when you look at the geology of this, some of that may not well be available, but a lot of it may not be available. But the other side of it is the American experience is that when you look actually directly for unconventional gas, you find more. So those figures give you some sort of sense of the magnitude of what we're dealing with. Now, my next slide, please. Now, for exploration going on, a whole series of European countries. Perhaps the most interesting is in Poland, where you've got about 50 exploration licenses operating in parts of northern Poland. Currently, the best estimates are about 1.5 trillion cubic meters of shale gas. That's roughly about 100 years of Polish supply. Now, whether that actually turns out to be exactly true or there's more or whatever, we'll find out in the next few months as more of the drilling takes place. The UK is suggesting that as the coal bed producers in the UK, another form of unconventional gas, they're suggesting that the unconventional gas there may well be principally coal bed, and perhaps in about a decade or so, it could be 20% of UK gas production. The most interesting feature I have recently is not from the EU, but from outside the EU in Ukraine, where Eurogas are saying that they've found 12 trillion cubic meters of gas, which they can produce at about $120 per thousand cubic meters, which is a major find if that all turns out to be correct. And I have some of the technical papers on that, but whether it's actually true, well, we'll see. Well, that's what's been talked about. Now, briefly, on a few of the points which I think are worth raising. The next slide, please. There are a whole series of environmental issues with all of this. I think one of the biggest issues is density of wells. In order to currently get the gas out in the United States, all of the wells have to be close together. They're not massively apart as they are in a ordinary conventional well setup. So you can see having a forest of rigs might be quite unattractive. There are issues about water collection of the hydro fluid which is used in the ground, how you get it out, how you treat it, how it's properly disposed of. There are issues about trying to avoid drilling through aquifers and protecting the water table. Flaring issues as well. When you're testing the well, you may want to flare it, and that could cause problems. Lots of flaring across the European countryside might be quite slightly unattractive. There's an issue about European adaptation. How far can we adapt it to European circumstances? What do we need to do? But we can raise more of that in the debate. Next slide. The issue which I think is worth just highlighting is about LNG. The shale gas, the unconventional gas revolution, is already having an impact in Europe by virtue of the fact that all of the LNG stations on the eastern seaboards of the United States are already switching off because they don't need the gas at home. So what you're finding is that gas which would have been competed for between Europe and the States now actually is much more likely to come to Europe. And then there's, if you like, there's that LNG effect, there's an LNG plus effect of there's so much gas being produced, the question of whether some of that gas will actually be liquefied and put into competition in the European marketplace. So, next slide. And then there's a whole broader issues about the role of Russian gas, the impact of EU liberalisation, what happens to Gazprom, and the whole issue about CO2. Gas is 40% less CO2 emitting than coal. How will this play out? Should we use gas rather than coal? Lots of issues there. At that point, I'll stop. Okay?
Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to go over to Philip Lowe from the Directorate General for Energy to talk about the European policy framework for what would happen if this unconventional gas is there and can be made available as readily as it has done in the US.
Right, I think it's more or less common consensus that Europe being energy dependent now and possibly more in the future, it's interested in all forms of energy from as diversified sources as possible, and particularly where energy is produced on its own soil. Why do we say that? Because obviously we want to remain competitive with the most cost-effective sources of energy, and we have to have some minimum conditions for security of supply throughout the European Union. And don't forget too that as long as we don't have major interconnections, whether in gas or in electricity, there will be parts of the Union which will be even more dependent if they don't have alternative supplies. And I refer, for example, to Poland and other countries who might be affected by the possibilities for unconventional gas. Now, Alan has given you virtually all the facts. I think one or two facts are also relevant. We're not talking here in terms of potential about reserves which measure up to the US reserves. We're talking about something like, as we understand it, something like 10% of what the Americans say they've got. And in the most optimistic scenarios, we might be able to talk about 10% of total gas needs, or maybe even energy needs, if we're more ambitious. And of course, there's the third part of the triptych of any European energy policy, which happens to be necessarily what we do about moving towards a decarbonized energy mix. Bearing in mind, too, that investment in renewables is also a form of investment which provides for not only sustainability but security of supply, insofar as you don't have to pay for wind and sun as long as it's there. But you may have to subsidize it if its costs are too high, and that's a real problem. Now, the Commission's attitude to gas is, first of all, gas is gas. So from a market point of view, unconventional and conventional gas are in the same market. That's why we have a glut on world markets at the moment. As Alan explained, we have a diversion of LNG towards Europe. We also have Qatar, Australia, other countries massively increasing their output. And we have Gazprom prepared to expand if it wanted to, and where it considers that the commercial conditions are there to do it. One couldn't expect any of these players in Qatar or Australia or Russia to be particularly enthusiastic about investments in unconventional gas, whether it's in form of shale gas or methane, coal bed methane. But we don't see any reason to be unenthusiastic about the need to develop these forms of these sources of energy in Europe, providing they can genuinely have a chance genuinely of being competitive. And there, first of all, we have to make sure that the technologies are sufficiently developed to conditions in Europe. And the conditions are different. There are big areas of the US where you can place wells close to each other on a dense basis, whereas I would agree that in Poland and other countries there may be similar conditions, but not quite as perhaps favorable in environmental terms, at least in terms of the impact on the visual impact on the environment and the impact on communities. If there are communities involved, everything becomes more complicated in Europe, including CO2 underneath cities in parts of Europe, which apparently is more dangerous than having storage tanks of natural gas underneath your cities. But there's a public acceptability problem there too. And of course, we have to make sure, more in the wider sense, the effect on geological conditions are such that this can be carried out with some degree of security. Now, there are already in place the regulations with hydrocarbon exploration in the EU with national authorizations, whether it's unconventional or conventional sources. So we don't see immediately the need for a new regulatory framework to deal with the authorization of projects concerned, but clearly we have to make sure that the technological challenge is overcome. That is it feasible in relation to exploitations in the conditions in Europe? And secondly, we have to pay attention very carefully to the environmental impacts in terms of the effects on soil, water, etc. And of course, we have to work out, and at least every government, every corporation involved in this has to work out to what extent exploitation of this source of energy nevertheless leaves us on the roadmap towards a decarbonized economy in what is at the moment agreed to be the aim, which is something like 85% to 95% reduction in emissions by 2050. Now, that's not impossible. It might be that unconventional, if it's proven in terms of cost, technology, environment, could displace some imports of LNG. And particularly for those countries where there is not sufficient interconnection to imagine that LNG would become a natural source of gas as opposed to imported pipeline gas. So we see this debate on unconventional gas, whether it's coal bed methane or shale gas, as a debate where we should leave the doors open. It seems to us that there is plenty of incentive for commercial investment in research in this area and exploration, but there are questions to be answered, like there are for every other single source of energy at the moment, whether it's coal with CCS or gas with conventional gas with CCS, or indeed unconventional gas with CCS. We would want to follow this area very closely. As I said at the beginning, every single source of energy is important for an energy-dependent Europe, from a competitiveness point of view and from a sustainability point of view. And we really depend upon the very best standards being met in Europe. Nevertheless, if we're to see this develop in a successful way, we've got to reassure our populations that we have carried out the necessary environmental impacts. And of course, ultimately, the mix of energy chosen by our member states and interconnected together in the European infrastructure network will have to reflect what's most commercially interesting as well as what could be viable from a security of supply point of view.